There are voices that feel eternal, voices that seem to carry joy so effortlessly that the world forgets to ask what they cost. Judy Garland's voice was one of them, bright, trembling, unforgettable, a voice that could make millions believe in hope, while slowly breaking the girl who carried it. Long before Hollywood called her a legend, Judy was simply a child standing under lights too powerful for any young soul. She sang not because she chose to, but because the world demanded it. By the time audiences fell in love with her smile, the machinery behind the curtain had already decided who she would become and how much she would be allowed to endure. Inside the grand studios of MGM, her life moved according to schedules written by adults who saw her talent before they saw her humanity. Pills to wake her up, pills to put her to sleep, diets imposed on a growing body, perfection demanded without mercy. The applause was thunderous, but it never reached the quiet spaces where Judy sat alone, exhausted, afraid, and far too young to understand why happiness felt so distant. Her fortune would rise, her fame would circle the globe, but the cost was invisible and irreversible. Behind the iconic image of Dorothy walking a yellow brick road, there was another journey unfolding. One without magic, one without safety, one where childhood dissolved into obligation and love was replaced by expectation. How does a child learn to survive when the world only applauds her performance, never her pain? How does a voice so full of wonder become a cry no one hears? Judy Garland's story does not begin with tragedy. It begins with silence. The silence of a child taught too early that her worth depended on how beautifully she could sing. Judy Garland's rise did not feel like a miracle. It felt like inevitability engineered by a system that had already decided her fate. By the late 1930s, Hollywood no longer saw her as Frances Gumm, a little girl from Minnesota, but as an asset, a voice that could be shaped, pushed, and endlessly consumed. Success arrived early, wrapped in costumes, rehearsals, and expectations far too heavy for a child still learning who she was. The Wizard of Oz changed everything. Dorothy's innocence became Judy's prison. Her performance was luminous, a fragile courage that resonated with a world on the brink of war. Over the Rainbow wasn't just a song, it was a promise. Audiences believed it, studios monetized it, and Judy, standing at the center of it all, learned the most dangerous lesson Hollywood ever taught a child, that love is conditional. Behind the scenes, her days were meticulously controlled. Sleeping pills at night, stimulants in the morning, strict diets enforced with cruelty disguised as discipline. She worked longer hours than many adults under hot lights that never dimmed. Smiles were mandatory, fatigue was unacceptable. Emotion, unless scripted, was a liability. Her body was still growing, but the industry treated it as a finished product, something to be maintained, corrected, punished if it failed to comply. The illusion of happiness was flawless. Magazine covers glowed, premieres sparkled. Applause roared like validation. Yet inside, Judy felt something slipping away. Childhood did not fade gently. It vanished, replaced by schedules, contracts, and a constant fear of disappointing those who controlled her future. She laughed on cue, sang on command, and learned to hide exhaustion behind professionalism before she understood what either word truly meant. Her fortune grew, her fame expanded beyond borders, but her sense of self quietly eroded. In her dressing room, after the lights shut off, silence returned. Mirrors reflected a girl unsure whether she existed beyond the roles she played. The joy the world adored was real, but it was incomplete. Because joy, when demanded, stops being joy. It becomes labor. And so Judy Garland rose, higher than most ever would, while something essential remained behind on the studio floor, a childhood that would never be returned to her. As Judy Garland moved from adolescence into early adulthood, the cracks beneath her smile widened. Slowly at first, then with a cruelty that no spotlight could hide. The world still saw a radiant star, a voice that seemed to promise comfort and escape. But behind the curtain, Judy's body and mind were beginning to rebel against years of control, exhaustion, and chemical dependence forced upon her long before she could consent. The pills that once kept her obedient now kept her trapped. Stimulants robbed her of rest. Sedatives stole her mornings. And between the two, her sense of reality blurred. Her relationships suffered quietly. Trust was difficult when nearly every adult in her life had once treated her talent as currency. Love, when it appeared, felt conditional, fragile, easily withdrawn. She married young, searching for stability, for someone who might see her beyond the performances. But the damage had already settled deep. Insecurity clung to her like a second skin. On set, her reliability began to falter. Late arrivals turned into missed days. Missed days became warnings. Warnings became punishments. Hollywood, the same system that had shaped her into a phenomenon, now grew impatient with the consequences of its own creation. Executives whispered about her difficulty. Contracts tightened. Sympathy evaporated. There was little room for compassion in an industry that demanded perfection without accountability. Inside her home, nights stretched endlessly, ashtrays filled, unfinished scripts piled up. Music played softly in the background, not for joy, but for survival. Judy sang not because she wanted to, but because it was the one language she still trusted. Her voice carried pain the world had never taught her how to express otherwise. Every performance became both release and reminder, proof that she still mattered, and evidence of how much she had already lost. The smile remained. It always did, because she had learned too well that smiling kept her employed. But behind that smile lived fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of irrelevance, fear that without applause, there would be nothing left. The child who once sang about rainbows had grown into a woman who no longer believed in them, yet was forced to sell the illusion night after night. And with each passing year, the distance between who Judy was and who Hollywood needed her to be grew more unbearable, a quiet fracture that could no longer be ignored. The breaking point did not arrive as a single collapse. It arrived as a series of small, merciless moments that accumulated until Judy Garland could no longer carry them. By the late 1940s, her body was exhausted, her mind fractured by years of chemical dependence and emotional neglect. Hollywood still demanded performances, still demanded smiles. But Judy was running out of places to hide. Her reliability, once unquestioned, became a battleground. Missed rehearsals led to fines. Delays became public humiliations. Concern quickly turned into punishment. The studio that had raised her now treated her as a liability. MGM suspended her. Contracts dissolved. Doors that once opened effortlessly now closed with quiet finality. Judy, barely into her late 20s, was being discarded by the very system that had molded her since childhood. Inside her home, the atmosphere felt heavy, almost airless. Curtains drawn against daylight. Prescription bottles lined neatly along the bathroom counter. Letters left unanswered on the table. She tried to regain control. Attempted detoxes, hospital stays, promises to herself that tomorrow would be different. But recovery, rushed and unsupported, only deepened her despair. Without proper care, every attempt to stop using was followed by sharper crashes, darker nights, longer silences. Her marriage strained under the weight. Arguments echoed through hallways already filled with disappointment. Love could not compete with trauma this deep, nor could it erase the years of damage done before she even knew she needed protection. Friends came and went. Trust eroded. Isolation settled in. Publicly, the narrative hardened. Unstable. Difficult. Finished. Privately, Judy felt herself disappearing. Not as a star, Mustrin, but as a person. She once confessed that she felt safest on stage because it was the only place where her pain had a purpose. Off stage, there was no script, no applause, no cue telling her when to breathe. One night, overwhelmed and desperate, she attempted to end her life. It was not a cry for attention. It was exhaustion. She survived, physically, but the attempt marked a line she could never fully step back from. From that moment on, Judy Garland was no longer just a troubled star. She was a woman openly struggling to survive a life built too early, too fast, and too publicly. The child who had been taught to sing through everything finally reached a moment where even her voice could no longer save her. The final years of Judy Garland's life were marked by a cruel paradox. As her public performances grew more powerful, her private world became increasingly fragile. She was no longer the child star molded by studios, nor the young actress fighting for relevance. She had become something else, a survivor, carrying the visible scars of a life lived under relentless pressure. Her finances told a story of instability. At various points, her earnings soared, only to collapse again under the weight of lawsuits, unpaid taxes, broken contracts, and mounting medical bills. Money flowed in quickly and vanished just as fast. Fame never guaranteed security. In fact, it often amplified the chaos. Judy worked constantly not for luxury, but for survival, chasing stability that always seemed just out of reach. Yet on stage, something extraordinary happened. Her voice, roughened by pain and exhaustion, gained a new depth. Audiences felt it immediately. When she sang, it was no longer the voice of innocence. It was the voice of lived suffering. Every note carried loss, resilience, longing. People didn't just listen, they leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing something painfully honest. Applause came not out of excitement, but reverence. Behind the curtains, the cost was immense. Her body weakened. Her dependence on medication deepened. Her health deteriorated quietly. Hotel rooms replaced homes. Nights blurred into one another. She surrounded herself with people who offered companionship, but few who could truly protect her. Attempts at sobriety continued, each one sincere, each one undermined by inadequate care and the constant demand to perform. Motherhood, briefly, gave her something close to grounding. Her children became anchors, reminders of a life beyond applause. But even love could not fully undo decades of damage. Judy carried guilt constantly. Guilt for being absent, for being unwell, for not being able to become the version of herself she believed others deserved. In the late 1960s, she found renewed success abroad. London embraced her with a warmth Hollywood had long withdrawn. Concert halls filled again. Critics softened. For a moment it seemed as though redemption was possible, that the story might end in quiet dignity. But survival had already extracted its final price. Her body, exhausted beyond repair, began to fail. Years of dependency, stress, and neglect converged. Each performance felt heavier than the last. Each day required more effort simply to remain upright. Judy Garland died in 1969 at just 47 years old. Her death was not the sudden tragedy Hollywood portrayed. It was the final chapter of a long, grueling struggle that had begun when she was still a child. A life lived without pause, a voice given everything, and asked for more until there was nothing left to give. When the world remembers Judy Garland, it often remembers the rainbow, the dress, the song, the child with hope trembling in her voice. But legacy is not what we choose to remember. It is what remains after the applause fades. Judy Garland did not fail Hollywood. Hollywood failed Judy Garland. She was never given the chance to grow in safety, to make mistakes in private, to discover who she might have been without the weight of expectation crushing her before adulthood even began. Her talent was celebrated. Her humanity was ignored. And by the time the industry realized the cost of what it had taken, it was far too late to give anything back. Yet her story is not only one of loss. In her final performances, Judy did something rare and profound. She transformed suffering into truth. Her voice, once trained to sound joyful, became something deeper, honest, fractured, unmistakably human. Audiences did not come to see perfection anymore. They came to witness survival, to hear pain given shape, to feel understood. That is her real legacy, not the contracts, not the box office numbers, not even the legend, but the warning she left behind, written not in words but in a life lived too fast, too hard, too publicly. How many children followed her path before the industry learned to look away? How many voices were shaped before they were protected? How many smiles hid fear the world chose not to see? Judy Garland's story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about fame, about responsibility, about the price of entertainment. It reminds us that talent does not negate vulnerability, and success does not excuse neglect. She gave the world her voice. The world took her childhood. And in the quiet that followed, one truth remained. A legacy is not measured by how brightly someone shines, but by how gently they were allowed to live.